I must admit that while I do love the nations released after the original two that were available, I can't help but remain attached to Mondstadt and Liyue because I like the vibes of their cities in terms of culture and environment, and I've also warmed up to playable characters from those regions much more easily. This pattern is noticeable with my favorite archons since I really dedicated myself to pulling and max leveling the archons of Mondstadt and Liyue, while I haven't had concrete plans to really acquire the future archons. If I get them, great, but if I don't, I'm not upset either. The reason why I feel this way is probably partially due to the fact that I'm quite stubborn and set in my ways, so I'm not as readily accepting of new characters. But aside from that, I really do have a great appreciation for how the first two nations are run, especially when it comes to how interconnected the people are there. However, I wouldn't say that the main reason why I appreciate Venti and Zhongli is because of their philosophy when it comes to governance. I just like them because of their personalities, with them being quirky but also old and insightful. It makes for a nice mix. In fact, I learned about Venti when my albedo main friend was trying to pull him, so he was brought to my attention quite early. And as for Zhongli, he was actually the character that convinced me to play the game. I wouldn't say I'm currently such a huge Zhongli stan, but I meant to say that I was drawn to the way Genshin wrote their characters' personalities because of the details I learned about him. I already knew of Zhongli from my albedo main friend who told me that he was an archon, but it was my Xiao main friend who told me about how he was broke and living as a regular human. I found the premise surrounding that to be hilarious, and when I searched him on the internet, there was this one quote that made me crack up. It was, Rex Lapis said, "Ones who break their contracts shall suffer the wrath of the rock." It's not funny in itself, but I was amused on two levels. One, he seems to be very serious about punishment, and after watching a few legal K-dramas, I was very much interested in having people put in their place for their wrongdoings. And two, the fact that he basically quoted himself is just sending me. As for Venti, you wouldn't believe how hard I made Zhongli and the others work their asses off just for him to come home. As in, I'd gone through so many uncompleted world quests in 2.5 in anticipation of Venti in 2.6 because I really wanted to guarantee him. Luckily, I won 50-50 with Zhongli's help, although, I know rituals don't impact pulls factually speaking. Of course, these two very lore-heavy characters are worth exploring on their own, but again, I'm busy right now and I saw the opportunity of lumping them together since they're both the two remaining members of the original 7. And yes, I do actually ship them, so this setup is very convenient for me. But aside from those, I've noticed lots of parallels between them, despite having sort of opposite elements, with Anemo being flighty and constantly changing, and Geo being firm and steady, as well as them having seemingly opposite values being freedom and contracts. To examine those further, I'm going to divide my discussion into their roles as archons, as well as their personalities as regular, quote-unquote, human citizens of their respective nations. As archons, Venti and Zhongli do initially seem quite different because Venti took a more hands-off approach to governance, while Zhongli took a more active role in shaping Liyue's society. As a result, I believe many people in the fandom haven't been respecting Venti so much as an archon because they only see him as a happy-go-lucky wine guy, which is a shame since, like Morax, Barbatos is also well respected and revered by the general populace of Mondstadt, despite there being a huge lack of information regarding his actual identity. I actually believe that both of them maintain a particularly high level of charisma, which is evidenced by the support they get from notable allies as well as from their citizens. Of course, all the archons are charismatic in some way because their constituents have a tendency to idolize them, except for Lesser Lord Kusanali, who is currently hated by the academia. But with Morax and Barbatos, they are notably glorified through legends, especially through oral tradition. Mondstadt has bards and Liyue has tea house storytellers who are able to emphasize the glory of their gods through the narratives they present about them, especially those that pertain to justice-seeking endeavors such as the revolution against the Carabian and the aristocracy, as well as Rex Lapis's vanquishing of other gods that were hostile to Liyue. Although Inazuma and Sumeru definitely have their legends as well, I'm not sure if the art of storytelling as a performance is as noteworthy, although I could be mistaken. This is not to say that those nations' archons are dull or less popular, but it seems that Rex Lapis and Barbatos have closer ties with ancient historical events, and history often leads itself to creative interpretation. I believe what makes the people's faith in them well supported rather than fickle is because of how appealing their values are. Freedom is something we humans are naturally fond of because of the way it gives us license to attain our fundamental rights and desires without restraint, as long as we're not hurting others. It's something associated with independence as well as a release from the burdens imposed on us by dictatorship or oppression, whether at the hands of the government, social norms, or even ourselves. So it's very obvious that people would naturally have a high regard for the God of Freedom, because despite the fact that he hasn't been closely intertwined with their lives, the mere fact that he permits them to strive for something so aspirational can be quite touching and inspiring. As for the God of Contracts, that term can come across as a bit technical and restraining, but I find it to be quite pro-people and pro-society as well, since agreements are made with other people and it helps us improve our relationship with them. It encourages us to respect other people and value their rights. In fact, I think there are many contracts that aren't burdensome to bear because of how willing people are to dedicate themselves to that particular commitment. Marriage is an example of such, and there are also many others. Interestingly, I think freedom is often respected through contractual agreements like human rights laws, and contracts that possess integrity are usually arranged out of free will. In comparison, eternity is something more difficult to grasp to the point that even A herself had to change her view of what it meant. And wisdom seems quite desirable, but it's also quite difficult to attain, and it can also easily be conflated with knowledge. Knowledge is good, but it's not necessarily the same as wisdom, and people can end up compromising their values or ethics if they're not careful with distinguishing between the two. And that's probably why Kusanali has to deal with an overly ambitious and destructive scholarly elite. Additionally, eternity and wisdom also seem kinda more superhuman. I can't be too sure about justice and war, which are the values of Fontaine and Natlan respectively, but they also seem a bit more intimidating and imposing, but that's just my take on it. That's not to say that the newer archons are bad at their job, but their arcs might revolve more around how they're relearning or reasserting what their values mean. Barbatos and Morax also had to recontextualize their values through their archon quests, with Venti showing that freedom isn't just leaving something alone, and Zhongli using a contract to end his long-standing contract as an archon, but they were still familiar with their own values since they themselves dictated them rather than inheriting them from predecessors. My point is, I think the reason why Rex Lapis and Barbatos remain so popular, not just among their human constituents but also their immortal allies, such as the Adepti for Morax and the Four Winds for Barbatos, is because of the way their values themselves capture the imagination of their people. I would go so far as to say that the actual archons don't actually matter as much as the contracts they represent, and that's why people hold them in high regard, even going as far as to paint them as much grander and closer to perfect than they actually were, because they see them as representations of something aspirational and inspirational. It's gotten to the point where Liyue historians think that Mora was made by Rex Lapis with mystical properties, and Mondstadt clerics can't imagine Barbatos as a prankster. Although these beliefs are inaccurate and there is a danger in glorifying deities too much, I think the idealized image these citizens have about their archons can help to facilitate the propagation of their values as long as they are able to interpret those values independently without having to rely on religious authorities with rigid interpretations of their gods' principles. I mean, I know this sounds weird, but Venti definitely has a lot of Jesus parallels, especially with how his presence has not been concrete and tangible, and when he does reveal his identity, people are doubtful about it. Plus, the church dedicated to him is very much inspired by the Catholic Church. However, people in Mondstadt are better able to retain Barbatos' pro-freedom and pro-people values, after the revolt against the aristocracy, of course, while lots of Christians nowadays tend to act like the kind of people Jesus would have been against. I don't know, just an observation. Additionally, I'd also like to point out some ways in which the fans kinda misconstrue these two archons, because I feel like these impact their perception a lot within the fandom. For one, as I said, Venti's sense of responsibility tends to be overlooked in favor of people viewing him as fun and wild. I would like people to recall his involvement in the rebellion against the Caribbean, his instigation of the revolt against the aristocracy through his apparition to Vanessa, his conscription of Durin to aid during the crisis of the Cataclysm, as well as his personal involvement in taming the Valin in the Archon quest. Additionally, he also reshaped the landscape of Mondstadt by even lifting chunks of mountain off to make it more habitable for the people, and that takes a clear vision and a lot of strength. Aside from that, he even created a fake treaty with a forged signature of Rex Lapis to scare the aristocrats' troops into thinking that they were going to be sold to become slaves in Liyue. So they turned against their bosses. I just feel the need to remind people of that because I think people tend to cast that aside to serve their own narrow perception of him as someone who's more of a comical figure, which he is, but he's also more than that. As for Zhongli, I think people overemphasize his being a stiff warrior god without acknowledging the social work he did for Liyue long ago aside from just throwing stone spears everywhere. His character story about why he doesn't like seafood explains that he once had to deal with a pesky sort of parasitic thing that took on a gooey form, and he did this through diligently visiting each house in Liyue to eliminate this widespread threat in a more systematic rather than aggressive manner. I also personally believe that while he was considered the brawn in contrast to Guizhong's brain, I think he wasn't like a dense person without a single thought in his brain except for aggression. Rather, I take it to mean that he was more ambitious and persistent on his goals, especially because of his strong protective nature towards his nation, while Guizhong was probably able to step back and strategize without being overly passionate about punishing the source of evil. So I interpret his warriorship to be more of a principled rather than bloodthirsty endeavor, if that makes sense. I guess there may be a bit of bloodthirstiness there, but I think it's not the main driving force. Although the great feats of these archons have proven to be quite spectacular, what I find more compelling about them is the fact that both of them are now currently living in society as humans, which is another trait they share that sets them apart from the reclusive archons of Inazuma, Sumeru, and I think Snezhnaya as well. This makes them a lot more approachable and relatable as we get to see them shed all their sparkly divine glory in favor of acting casually. This quote-unquote downgrade also provides for comedic moments because we get to appreciate the contrast between them acting high and mighty and just being broke, just like we are. Additionally, another source of amusement for us as an audience is seeing them act quite eccentric due to them having to adjust to their new lifestyle. So now they both kinda act like boomers despite looking young and fresh. I know that compared to Zhongli, Venti doesn't exactly act too old-fashioned because he's not overly particular about traditional customs. But whenever he's with a group of people, something about him just feels like he's morphing into an uncle. Like in the Golden Apple Archipelago starting quest in 2.8, where he provided the Dodo communication device to allow us to consult him, and the way he talks about Jean and even A in his voice lines, where there's a huge element of reminiscence. Even the way Venti and Zhongli reference each other in their voice lines really sounds like they're the type of grandpas who were friends since their teens and have a lot of tea to spill about each other. The point is, their antiquity now just gives off huge uncle or grandpa energy instead of seeming grand and respectable due to them being humbled by their change in status. They also now get to gain a better understanding of how their people have viewed them traditionally, albeit erroneously, and they help us as an audience understand that even back when they were archons, they might not have been as glorious as people thought they were, and currently, they're showing the less perfect parts of themselves as evidence of that. However, I don't think that this humbling should be viewed as something that would paint them as lowly, because I really enjoy their personalities in their regular person form, and I feel as though this enriches their characters. I think they both get to feel the satisfaction of living in the nations they put effort into protecting and cultivating, and they get to enrich the lives of their now fellow citizens from an immersed point of view, rather than watching them from above or from the sidelines. They now get to play the role of wise elders in their community that people can seek help, comfort, and advice from, provided that they're not either broke or drunk. This new experience of living amongst their former constituents also allows them to be more in touch with parts of their personality that probably couldn't be properly expressed when they were archons, at least for Zhongli, because he probably had to maintain a strict and decisive image a lot of the time, even when I assume part of him wanted to just relax and take long strolls, and now he gets to acknowledge the opinions of people like Keqing who want to usher in the era of human self-sufficiency without him feeling the need to be too defensive of his relevance to society. Additionally, they also get to make more friends from various walks of life aside from their fellow immortal allies, not just with the people in their respective countries, but also possibly with foreigners, like with Venti's active participation in the Irodori festival. I feel like they provide insight into the value the elderly bring to society through the experiences they share and pass on to the youth, who are able to hear their stories and witness their kind deeds. I'd also very much love for them to meet and just talk casually as old friends, and it'll be more interesting this time as their relationship can be recontextualized as well. They will no longer be two archon friends but just two regular friends who might be able to engage in leisure activities that they weren't able to do together before, such as probably eating at new restaurants together, watching street or tea house performances, as well as taking new routes for their strolls, or even possibly going abroad together if they can afford it. That hasn't seemed to have happened so far because they hadn't really met recently in-game, but I really hope it happens someday, especially because Zhongli got to visit Angel's Share and Venti could have been somewhere around that area, unless he was in transit to Inazuma, I don't know. I really just hope that they'll both continue to enjoy their lives as retirees and continue to assist and inspire more people around them, even though they aren't archons anymore. If only they were actual pensioners as well, they wouldn't need to worry about money that much anymore. And those are the reasons why I have a great appreciation for these two archons, and I love running them together in the same team to provide reassuring advice to my other party members. I also hope that the fans would continue to gain a better understanding of them, and that those of you who want to pull for them in the future, whether it be first acquisitions or cons, will be able to get them because they really are fun to use and also quite calming to have in a team. I'll be looking forward to more of their future involvements in quests and events, especially in festivals because those are the manifestations of all the work they put into shaping the culture of their nations. And I really hope these two meet soon, and if they do, you can expect me to squeal very loudly.
불의 신은 제멋대로 날뛰는 전투광이야. 바위의 신은 사람 마음을 모르는 꽉 막힌 놈이고. 그런 걸 어떻게 아냐고? 서사시에 그들의 이야기가 다 나와 있어. 그 시절의 이야기들이 전부.
거래의 규칙은 계약이고 준칙은 공평이지. 계약을 맺고 준수하는 자는 절대 잊어서는 안 돼. 공평함을 잃게 되면 계약은 기만의 근거가 되지.
Anyway, that's all for today and thanks for watching. Let me know who your favorite archons are and some additional thoughts you might have on them in the comments, and I'll see you next time.